words that are problematic and actually put us in a box in which we can't come up with solutions if we're using language that defines a segment of our population as an other for exclusionary purposes. So we've had to not only draw on unlikely partners, whether it be corporate or anybody in any community or any sector, but we've had to expand our language to include humanity and dignity, extremely fundamental language in order to further what we need to further for our community to receive basic services.
A question for the audience?
I'd just like to bring it, what you've said, to a case in point, because I think we have to ratchet up the challenge. And both of you have said things that absolutely resonate with me as a state legislator. Right here in Maryland, few miles up, huge Salvadorian Central American population around here, yet in the state capital of Annapolis, no knowledge, no presence, no political empowerment at all, starting in a climate that I think really requires a change in our agenda. I don't know what the current publication says, but if it's still the same previous agenda, in the larger context it might be correct, but we better begin to respond with much more urgency to the kind of problems that both of you have raised, because that's where we're dying out there. We're losing battles. And it's not just the undocumented that are being talked about. I think it really is our whole Latinos, our whole who we are. You talked, Gilberto, about just the identity, the nativity. Those are issues that we have not, I don't think, had it to this level of conflict as we currently have it in our society. So how do we get the 40 or 43 organizations that are talking at a national level and defining the agenda to really be relevant? I want to be able to have that relevance and help, because the only one out there trying to fight off 11 anti-immigrant bills last time, I was all alone. I called for Maldev, who's right here, and they said, we need to bring somebody up from Atlanta. Well, I'm glad they came, but I need even more consistent help and presence. So how do we do that? How do we make that happen? Because we're losing and we're desperate.
I remember, maybe you were here, I remember the riots up in Adams Morgan several years ago. I mean, the Central American Salvadorian population was really being oppressed in the city, and they just blew up. They just blew up. They still are. Yeah, I understand that. They just blew up. But what struck me the most was when the press went to cover the riots, the spokesperson for the Salvadorians and Central Americans was Raul Yzaguirre of the National Council of la Raza. Why? Well, now, why? It was a very recent immigrant population. They had the vast majority had just come. They hadn't had a chance to organize. Now they're organizing in Virginia very well. We have 13 Latino gangs in Northern Virginia. And that's part of where Aspira came from the gangs. As these recent immigrant populations are suffering, we cannot wait 20 years for them to develop their own organizations. I think we have to accelerate that process. I think the national organizations and local affiliates of national organizations have a responsibility to address organizing those communities, those recent immigrant communities, so that they can take a leap forward rather than having to go through everything that we had to go through. Because I know your frustration. You know, I live here in Virginia. It's the same thing. The Fairfax County public schools are inundated with Latino children who are coming in. They don't know what to do with them. And so they're going to drop out of school. And obviously that's why we have our gangs. So I think there is a responsibility for us to help develop organizations internally, community organizations, and in the meantime, get people like you, elected officials, support you from our national perspective until, and I don't want to be too sociological about this, until there's the capacity within the community itself to be able to serve as their own voice.
You know, but to be, if we're all going to be frank about this, you know, it was not too long ago that even in D.C., many of our own organizations were not comfortable dealing, representing, standing up for undocumented immigrants. The pragmatism of the politics of D.C. Won out, basically, and you see that in the 1996 Welfare Reform Act, where basically, you know, a whole sector was conceded, you know, in order to protect one, you know, small portion of the immigrant or the, you know, legal immigrant community. So I think that now, you know, it's, and then, you know, you have the both the anti-immigrant, that came, you know, in the context of the anti-immigrant movements of the 90s, you know, and now we have a corresponding, you know, different, but the post 9/11 again has created that problem, that division. I mean, on the driver's license, that's what you see. 4 years ago, the issue of the driver's licenses looked like it was, you know, people were coordinating, there was momentum, the insurance, you know, we had reached out to insurance companies, it looked like it was going to happen. And then after 9/11, again, you know, we, not only in our own organizations to some extent distanced themselves from that issue in an attempt to, you know, protect an even smaller group. So I think that it's not just a question of resources. I think there's been ambivalence on the part of some of our own organizations about how central and how important and how expendable the issues of the undocumented population are.
Just briefly, and first of all, I want to thank you for your service. We're so happy that you're there in Maryland. And we do resources, and for those of you that have the ability to impact that, please do. This is important. What you're saying here today is important. What all of us are saying is important. I hope that someone hears that can, and I know that everyone in here can effectuate change in some way, shape, or form, and please take the message with you. But the good and the bad news about what you're talking about is, one, is that we can be proactive right now as opposed to reactive, because what's happening in Maryland is also happening in Virginia, it's also happening in Georgia, it's also happening in Alabama, it's also happening in Florida. The anti-immigrant agenda is one that's coming from above, and it's all the same pieces of legislation. The good news is that the individuals who are introducing it have no idea what the basis of it is, you know, what it's for, what the reason is for. In Georgia, on an anti-immigrant bill, a long list of bills, but one that came before a particular committee was that would advocate for the CLEAR Act, to advocate for the civil enforcement of immigration laws, which is a lot of what law enforcement agencies are doing across the Southeast without the ability to be able to do it lawfully, that are criminalizing large segments of our Latino men before they even have the opportunity to exercise their right to vote. But this particular bill came up in Georgia. For the first time in Georgia history, we were able to turn a Republican on the issue who was aligned with the other Republicans that were pushing for this particular bill, and it stopped. And I believe the only reason why is because we had the knowledge to call people on the misinformation that was being provided to the other members, and it stopped. So we are at a critical juncture. All of this is just starting now, and yes, there are limited resources to deal with it, but the powerful tool is the knowledge, and it is being replicated throughout, and we will be there again in Maryland.
We can take that as a closing statement for this session. I would like to now ask Nick Kanellos to give the closing remarks here. Nick has been a tremendous leader in the Academy. Arte Público Press obviously is an important vehicle in reaching